We're delighted to have all of you joining us. Our first speaker is Erik Peckar. He's the general manager of Vineyard Power, a community-owned cooperative whose aim is to help build a sustainable energy future for Martha's Vineyard. As the manager, Erik organizes and executes day-to-day operations. Erik is primarily involved with company outreach while aiding Vineyard Wind through the permitting process to become the first offshore wind farm in Massachusetts. He has worked extensively on the community empowerment, a piece of proposed legislation in Massachusetts designed to enable communities through a democratic process to expand local renewable energy and development. Just to get, sorry, I apologize, I didn't give everyone the format of the session today. Each speaker will have approximately 10 minutes to present. Ask that you could use the Q&A box for all questions, which I'll be managing. After each speaker has a chance to present, we'll then open up for questions, and I'll be giving questions to each speaker in the order that they came in. First, Erik, followed by Bill, and then Rebecca, questions for Rebecca. We will aim to end right at 2 p.m. So we ask everyone to please keep your remarks to the 10 minutes. Without further ado, we'll have the technology person please give Erik the ability to share his screen, and we'll get started.
Great, thank you so much. Start it here. Okay. Just get myself organized here. Thank you all so much. Oh. So my name is Erik Peckar. Shalom, everybody. For the past 10 years, I've been working for a local nonprofit here on the island of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts in the Northeast. It's called Vineyard Power Cooperative. First, I'd like to just thank the organizers of the Social Vision Conference, in particular, Jonah and the Wexlers, for inviting me to participate in today's important discussion. So my local organization, we have a really unique community partnership with a large offshore wind farm developer called Vineyard Wind. Vineyard Wind is in the process of permitting the first commercial scale offshore wind farm here in the United States. And today I'll be speaking to you as someone who's been able to be involved not only in the permitting and development side of this wind farm, but also as someone from the community perspective side of the coin to try to give everybody a sense of where we are with offshore wind development here in the United States and where it might be going. I'd just like to say this is a really exciting time for us in the industry, the offshore wind farm industry, you know, as while we're here trying to address the existential threat of climate change. So the first question, you know, we want to ask is why offshore wind here in the United States? So I think I want to there's a couple parts to this answer, and I think I just want to begin, you know, I believe we have a moral obligation to combat climate change, reduce the impacts that it has on sea level rise as oceans continue to warm, as well as acidify. And us living here on an island of Martha's Vineyard, I always tell people that, you know, we have a kind of a front row view of these impacts. So what can we do about all of this? First, I think we need to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And two of the largest renewable energy resources here in New England are solar and wind, particularly offshore wind. Offshore wind is going to be the major renewable energy that we use. There'll be a little bit of solar here in Massachusetts, but predominantly it's going to be offshore wind. And this might not necessarily be the case across, you know, all regions in the United States. You know, in Arizona, it could be solar. You know, in the Pacific Northwest, there could be more hydro. So as we tend to drift away from fossil fuels and we think about renewables, each region in the United States will have, you know, potentially a separate answer or maybe a combo platter of combinations of ideas and solutions to solve this problem. So there's a chart here, a couple different charts here that we have. And on the left side, we have, it's a chart that shows basically the wind power resource offshore of the United States. And on the right side, we show essentially a vision of all the lights or the megalopolises essentially on the East Coast of the United States. So what I just want to illustrate here is that offshore wind is very close to the demand centers of where we're primarily using most of our electricity. 40% of the US population is in a county on the coast, and 80% of the United States lives within around 16 miles of the coast. So both our current federal and Massachusetts administrations have set similar climate targets of net zero emissions by 2050. And we here on Martha's Vineyard locally on a town by town level, we have actually 6 towns here on the island. We have a similar target that our island move to 100% renewable electricity, heating, and transportation by 2050. So as it stands now, two of the 6 towns have enacted a resolution to meet these targets. So, over, I'd say, in the sense of, my lifetime and, maybe a generation below me's lifetime, we're going to start seeing, to be a part of this big movement to renewables. And this is, from my perspective, very exciting, as we're really on the ground floor of something that's going to be really big. So this is just to give everybody a sense of where we are with the potential offshore wind farm development here in the United States. And so in order to develop any type of renewable energy project, you essentially need 3 things. You need an area to develop the site, and you need what's called a power purchase agreement or an offtake agreement to sell your electricity to a customer. Typically, these are utility companies, but we're seeing more and more private companies like Apple and Google make these commitments as well. And then you need your permits. And once you get all those, that leads to financing to be able to develop the wind farm. So right now in the United States, we essentially have a very limited amount of offshore wind actually being produced. There's actually only 7 offshore wind turbines here in the United States. The majority of development over the history of offshore wind has happened in Europe, and primarily in the North Sea, and in Denmark and Germany and the UK as well. So we're starting to see more of the first footholds here into the industry are starting in the US, and particularly in the Northeast. So from 2010 to 2020, these areas that are highlighted, except for the areas in purple, are areas that have been leased by the federal government to offshore wind farm developers. So just as a sense, we have New Jersey here, we have New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts up here, and then where I live on this little island, Martha's Vineyard, is right here. So currently there's 25,000 megawatts of offshore wind in the project development pipeline, which is around 30 or so offshore wind projects up and down the coast. And this would power enough for roughly 12 million homes. If all of these areas are to be developed, the total capacity of these areas is around 52 megawatts, or around 60 projects, or around roughly 24 million homes. So just kind of give everybody a sense, Massachusetts alone, we have around 2 million homes here. So with these projects, the project I'll be speaking specifically, and the project I've worked on primarily is this Vineyard Wind project, which is this particular lease area here. And what's interesting to note about these lease areas is they have the ability to sell into different markets, like state markets, for their renewable energy production. So we're seeing a lot of states essentially make particular targets for offshore wind farm development. The state of New York has about 9,000 megawatts or 9 gigawatts of offshore wind target, and Massachusetts has around 3,500 megawatts as well. And you're seeing Rhode Island, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, basically all these states up and down the East Coast making these commitments. So I'll talk a little bit about the particular project, the Vineyard Wind 1 project, which I've had the ability to work on over the last 4 or 5 years. So here's the island of Martha's Vineyard. I just want to say, Vineyard Wind is a joint venture between Avangard Renewables, which is primarily a large land-based wind farm developer here in the US, and Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, which is a Danish investment firm. And one thing I kind of always reference is, all roads in offshore wind essentially lead to Copenhagen or Denmark, because they primarily started the industry up, and they're making really great gains in offshore wind in Europe. So this first project is an 800 megawatt project. It has enough power to provide electricity for over 400,000 homes and businesses, and reduce carbon emissions by around 1.6 million tons a year. So that's the equivalent of about 325,000 gas-powered cars removed from the road every year in just this one project. So kind of going back, when there's 60 projects that are built of the capacity that I recently mentioned, that's around 19 million vehicles removed in terms of emission reduction. So this is a very big, emissions reductions capture right here, just in this offshore wind farm developments being procured right now here in the Northeast. So one thing we've been working on here on Martha's Vineyard is, in terms of the job creation, There'll be the construction port, which is primarily an 18-month to 2-year timeline. Those jobs are primarily going to be out of New Bedford. Those are going to be union-based jobs. And then they're what are called operations and maintenance jobs, or O&M jobs. And those are the jobs that are essentially the life of the project, the 25, 30-year life of the project, where you have offshore wind farm technicians going out and servicing the turbines, maybe replacing a part here on a nacelle or replacing a part there, but they're going out and they're servicing the turbines for the life of the project. So these are the long-term, stable benefit jobs. And those, we really lobbied Vineyard Wind, and they made a commitment to our community that they were going to locate the operations and maintenance facility here on Martha's Vineyard. So that was a really big win for us here locally. And then you'll see this is where the wind farm will be. Each one of these little dots represents a turbine, and then the cable will be coming through what's called Muskegon Channel here and up through Nantucket Sound, and then making landfall and interconnecting on the grid here in Cape Cod, and then just being part of the energy mix here. And then one thing I always like to point out is we have 4 electric cables that connect Martha's Vineyard to the mainland here already. So we'll be getting this electricity here, and there's 2 that connect. This is Nantucket Island that connect Nantucket to the Cape as well. And one thing I'd like to mention too is that Vineyard Wind also just announced that they'll be using the GE 13 megawatt offshore wind turbine. This is the largest offshore wind turbine commercially available right now. And it's around 260 meters, around 850 feet tall. So these are very, very, very giant machines. One rotation of the blade is able to power your home for 2 full days. So just to give everybody a sense of how much electricity is being produced and how much potential offshore wind, or how much electricity potential is available in the wind. So community buy-in is super important, in the conversation that we had with this offshore wind farm development. I again work for this company, Vineyard Power. You see our logo there, and we have a unique partnership with the development company, Vineyard Wind, and we've been involved in day-to-day operations and activities. Since around 2016 when they were awarded the lease area. I personally been working on the project since 2010. So it's been a long road to get to this point. And as I mentioned before, we identified opportunities to bring, local benefits within the community, and identify, potential concerns, from the community and bring those concerns up to the project. And it's just been a really great partnership. I can't say enough about working with this larger developer. And I think it's just a pretty unique experience for us. I mentioned that we're going to have an operations and maintenance facility in Vineyard Haven. We're also going to be developing solar projects for low-income ratepayers. It's called our Resiliency and Affordability Program. That's something that the project has committed to. And we're also working on a really big outreach effort in terms of local workforce development here. We have a cooperation with our local school system and education. One of the challenges is, living on an island, gaining having access. We don't have a community college here, but for people in the community here to be able to take courses, and on wind farm technician, to get the wind farm technician certificate. So we've been working with the local community college here and another nonprofit here to be able to offer those courses here locally for residents, and students here on Martha's Vineyard. So that's been a really big plus. And so far we have about 15 to 20 students that are taking these courses now to be wind farm technicians. And then, as we mentioned previously, we're working on a piece of legislation. We've been working on this for probably too long. We're going to be submitting it hasn't passed in the Massachusetts legislature yet, but we'll be resubmitting it in the next couple of weeks here when the session starts up. And this piece of legislation is called community empowerment, and it's a proposed legislation that would allow our community, or any community in Massachusetts, to be able to buy electricity from a particular project. In our example, it would be an offshore wind farm, because what's happening is you're having a lot of these towns, here locally in Massachusetts, commit to be, say, 50% renewable or 100% renewable. And it's just what we call kind of a tool in the toolbox to allow these communities and towns to reach those targets. So I just finished just to say the experience I've had with the project, on Martha's Vineyard has been illuminating and interesting. And, through the whole project, I've found, how much this project is bigger than just the engineering or the technology. And to me, it's really about building a community and community relations. And, there's something deeper there, connecting all of us, who care about the island and wanting to do something, to help solve climate change. It's about setting, a foundation for future generations of people here locally, and about having a connection to our own energy production. So right now in Massachusetts, we import all of our fossil fuels to run most of the power plants here in the state. And this is an opportunity for us locally to lead the nation in renewable energy production. And the last time Massachusetts was a leader in global energy production was in the whaling industry during the 18th and 19th centuries. And again, speaking of connections to your electricity, I think it's also really important that it's about connecting your energy sources to your usages. So when you turn your lights on or you plug in your electric vehicle, that electricity is coming from, a wind farm, that you can walk down, down the road and, see off the shores, and that it's making energy and powering your lights. And it's not coming from some blank space or some place you've never seen or thought of. And I think to me that this connection is just really important. And, I'd maybe just finish there and just saying that, that it's just been a really, really enlightening process to be involved in this project. And here's my contact details. So I just want to say, if anybody, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions after this, or, of course, if you find yourself on the island of Martha's Vineyard wandering around and, maybe, you want to catch up or grab a beer and another time. Also, I bartend at a local brew pub here on the island. So there's always time to catch up and talk renewable energy and talk about all the kind of things that are happening in the world. So thank you again, and I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you so much, Erik. It's mentioned that air is more important than food and drink. And it says in the last verse of Psalms, of Tehillim, that every soul, in Hebrew, soul is neshama, should praise God. And Rabbi Levi teaches on this verse, for every breath, neshama, we should praise God. Because really, with breath, all of our life force is created. And through breath, through speaking, we're able to communicate with other people. And it was beautiful to learn more about your project and what you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing. We'd like to move to our second speaker. Bill McKibben is a contributing writer to the New Yorker and a founder of a grassroots climate change campaign, 350.org. He's also the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. And he was a 2014 recipient of the Right Livelihood Prize, which is sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, and the Gandhi Peace Award, excuse me. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor McKibben to share his thoughts with us. Thank you.
Well, Reb Murray, many thanks for asking me, and what a pleasure to get to follow Erik and reflect on that remarkable work that they're up to. One of the things that he didn't talk about so much, but that I think is really important to think about, is the way in which in a new world we get a new aesthetic, a new sense of what's beautiful and desirable. When people first proposed wind turbines off the coast of Massachusetts, the reaction was much as it has been sadly here in Vermont. I don't want to look at it. And it took some time to overcome that there. But I'm always reminded, Reb Murray, to go from from the scripture you were just quoting, I'm always reminded that a wind turbine is a way to make the breeze visible. And I'm reminded too of traveling in Tibet and watching in villages where people had very, very rudimentary little hydropower systems to power their lives, that when the water came out at the end of the hydropower system, the last thing it did was turn a small prayer wheel. And in the Buddhist tradition, each turn of the prayer wheel is another prayer offered up. So, each time that big turbine spins and powers a house, it also is just a reminder about the breath that we find in the very first verse of Genesis, blowing across the planet that we were given. I want to talk for a minute about the reason why what Erik's talking about is so important. And then I want to talk about the ways in which it's going to be brought to scale, one hopes, in time to do some good. I wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience 32 years ago now, in 1989, when I was a young man. And at the time, it was, the scientists were warning us about what was coming. And we ignored the warning. And hence, we now increasingly live in the world that they predicted. And it is a difficult, difficult world. So far, we've raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree Celsius, and that's been enough to kick off almost unlimited chaos and destruction. 2020 was the hottest year we've yet measured on this planet. And with it, if it had not been the year of the pandemic, it would have been the year of the wildfire and the hurricane. We had conflagrations and blazes from Australia to Siberia to California to, in the late autumn, South America, where the world's largest wetland, the Pantanal that stretches across Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay, 25% of the world's largest wetland caught on fire and burned. It was the year with more hurricanes than any other. We got through our alphabet and we're deep into the Greek alphabet by the time the hurricane season finally drew to a close, illustrating, as always, the incredible injustice, unfairness of what's been unleashed. The last 2 hurricanes of the year blew into Central America, smacked the same spot in Nicaragua, and then did enormous damage in Honduras. The damage, in fact, in that country may have been equivalent to about 40% of Honduran GDP. By contrast, the largest storm ever to hit the US, Katrina, did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. So basic bottom line, the less you did to cause the climate crisis, the sooner and harder you are hit. We're on a path right now to take that 1 degree Celsius and turn it into 3 degrees Celsius, maybe a little bit more by the end of this century. If we do that, we will not be able to have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. That's simply too much energy in this closed system, too much trauma, too much disaster. And so our job is to stop it, and we don't have very much time in which to do that. The climate scientists have told us that if we haven't transformed our energy systems, which they helpfully defined as cutting emissions in half by 2030, then the chance of meeting the climate targets we set at Paris just 5 years ago will have gone by the boards. So that's an enormous challenge, and it'll take many, many, many projects like the one Erik has just described to get us anywhere near that target. The good news is, as he's been making clear, that the engineers have done their job, especially over the last decade. And above all, that means in lowering the cost of renewable energy in dramatic fashion. It's dropped an order of magnitude, 90% over the last decade, to the point where the sun and the wind are now the cheapest way to generate power across almost all the planet. And that's very good news. It allows us to move quickly if we want to. The question is the wanting to part, and that's much harder. Erik is testimony to how long this can take. He's been working for a decade, and most of that's been on the project of getting approvals and permits and financing, not the actual building of the thing, which it turns out is the smallest part of the challenge in many ways. There is enormous amount of inertia in our systems, and there's an enormous, enormous amount of vested interest. The fossil fuel industry is one of the biggest industries in the world, and it's kept us from action for almost 3 decades by mounting a massive campaign of disinformation and deceit about climate change. Hopefully that denial flew south on the airplane with President Trump, and we will not be having to deal with that level of deception and confusion in the future. But it doesn't take away the enormous effort that will have to mount to overcome the power of those vested interests. So I'll end by saying that I think the most important parts of overcoming that, unless you're an engineer, at which point stay on your lab bench and keep building ever more efficient solar panels. But if you're not, the single most important things that most of us can be doing are building the big movements that allow us to change the zeitgeist, the basic sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. We've been doing that for more than a decade now, starting with things like 350.org, and now we have lots and lots of wonderful movement, groups within this kind of movement space that really are getting the job done. I think the most important work probably at this point may lie in changing financial systems. I was thinking today that it was a year ago in 2020, right before the pandemic took hold. What I was doing this day a year ago was getting arrested in the lobby of the Chase Bank branch nearest the Capitol in Washington, because Chase Bank's the biggest lender to the fossil fuel industry, sent them $250 billion over the last 5 years since the Paris Climate Accords. We hardly needed Donald Trump to sabotage them because the big banks and asset managers and insurance companies were getting the job done. But we're standing up to them, and with some effect. The divestment campaign that we launched a decade ago is now the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history, with about $15 trillion in endowments and portfolios divested. Banks like Chase are feeling the heat. In fact, a few weeks ago, they announced that henceforth their lending would be Paris compliant, an airy phrase that doubtless will take a few more people going to jail to fully flesh out, but nonetheless a sign that it's possible for people to move even the biggest institutions when they push hard. So I hope and trust we will continue to push hard. That's our job, to make the promise of the engineering possible. 75 years from now, we will run the world on sun and wind because it's free. But if we wait 75 years or even 20 years to get there, then the world we run on sun and wind will be a broken world. So the job is to move with great dispatch and great speed. And that's why I'm so grateful to people who are doing that work.
Thank you so much for your remarks. There's a letter there was some research that was done of ecology in Chassidus. And there's a packet that was prepared, and Jesse will talk more about it now. There's lessons in stewardship of the planet from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And actually in 1981, Professor McKibben, the Rebbe gave a talk about the importance of solar and all the other alternative energies. And he closed the talk by saying, what's good for God is good for the creations, and there's no doubt that this will ultimately be achieved. At first, step by step, slowly, so we've already seen the slow part, and you've kind of talked about that. And Erik has also illustrated we've come through the slow part, so now it's time to speed things up, God willing. And just like in any process, the Rebbe continues, there will be a fear for those, I'll quote directly, just beginning this cause. Excuse me, there appears to be a typo here. Just beginning this cause will cause fear in those who oppose goodness and justice, and those who are opposed to the notion of all people living free and all Jews living free, which for Jews means to live in accordance with Judaism. For the nation's peace, you will have peace. And so we see from what the Rebbe wrote here in 1981, that there was going to be some opposition to moving towards renewables and making the world a better place. But just because there's opposition, there needs to continue to be activism and a push to make it happen. And we have someone with us, Professor Martusewicz, please forgive me if I pronounce your name incorrectly, who has been working on this for 31 years. Specifically in eco-justice education. And I'd like to invite her to give her comments, just a bit of a bio before we begin. She's a professor emerita in the Department of Teacher Education at Eastern Michigan University, EMU, and a Docent Professor at Tampere University in Tampere, Finland. In 1988, she received her doctorate from the University of Rochester, chaired and mentored by Dr. Philip Wexler. And for the next 31 years at EMU, she taught courses within the social foundations of education, focusing specifically on eco-justice education, globalization, ecofeminism, and advanced qualitative methods. Without further ado, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. First, I really want to thank the organizers for this conference. The panel this morning, as I was saying to Jesse, was wonderful. I learned a ton. But I also need to express my deepest gratitude to Philip Wexler, who was my mentor and my chair way back in the 80s. Philip taught me to ask authentic questions and really encouraged me to be an independent scholar and taught me what it means to be a mentor. I share my experience with Philip a lot with my own students, and I understand that he's here, and I want him to know how grateful I am for those years. I am a teacher educator. I would identify myself as a post-humanist feminist, and someone who's been involved for the last at least 20 years, probably more close to 25 years, within a movement that's known as eco-justice education. I'll just sort of lay out what that means, what an eco-justice approach to teacher education looks like, why it's important, and then how it sheds light on Philip's book on social vision. So there are three strands. First of all, there's an organizing principle within eco-justice that basically argues that the ecological crisis that we're facing, and that Bill and Erik have just done such a great job laying out, is a cultural crisis. It's a crisis in the way we think, in the way we organize ourselves socially, institutionally, and even psychologically. I'm sure those of you who know Philip's work and who've read this book will begin to hear some of Philip's influence as I talk through this. So the first strand we identify as a cultural ecological analysis, introducing teachers and other educators to the founding assumptions that organize our culture and our society. So institutionally, as well as psychologically. And basically what we look at is the ways a logic of domination saturates both our consciousness and our social interactions. So ethnocentrism or racism, androcentrism or sexism, and anthropocentrism, or the idea of human supremacy, weave themselves together in such a way that we're mostly unconscious of and that we often reproduce without even recognizing that we're doing it. And this happens discursively and is something that in order to move in the direction that Erik and Bill have just introduced us to, has to be challenged and has to be brought to the fore in order for us to become more conscious of what it is that has led to the problems that we're facing. But that's not all. That's not all that we are as people in this modern industrial culture. So the second strand is really focused on the practices, ways of knowing, relationships that lead to something else, that lead to an understanding that we need to care for each other. So those practices of care, sometimes referred to by people like Chet Bowers as the commons, come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and are diverse across the world. Especially interesting to look at, well, how they manifest in our own practices of ancient traditions, but also across diverse indigenous land-based cultures that organize themselves in ways that are much more sustainable than the modern industrial capitalist framework that we live in. Then the third strand is really about, and especially important to teacher education, I think, is how do we encourage the imagination necessary both to begin to bear witness to the underlying assumptions as they manifest in us, in our relationships, in our institutions that are causing such damage. How do we bear witness to the logics of domination, the value hierarchies that organize our lives in such damaging ways? And then how do we imagine something else, right? Or how do we recognize those practices that are so important in producing much more caring, loving, kind ways, not only among humans, but also between humans and the larger living world. So for what I try to organize courses for teacher educators, teachers, and community activists that begin the process of unpacking all of that and thinking about ways to reorganize the way we live. So what about this book, Social Vision? What did I love in this book? Well, I love that Philip starts with Max Weber's analysis of the Protestant ethic. Its huge contributions to the way capitalism organizes itself and rationalizes itself. Its manifestation in fear and anxiety. And then the way Philip uses that analysis to introduce a countervision in the Rebbe's work and in Jewish mysticism. So I have to say, I mean, again, what I loved probably most about this book is Philip's voice and sort of connecting to this incredible scholar that I knew in my younger years, in my 20s. And his sort of turn towards Jewish mysticisms and the Rebbe's influence and encouragement of ways of living that are about love, about joy, about reciprocity, about generosity, about how do we teach people to sort of affirm those ideals. I love the idea that we have to focus on the relationship between the individual and the collective. And in particular, the idea that individuality matters, that it matters a lot, that we need to nurture individuality within these larger values, and that's where we'll find the sacred. I'm reminded strongly of the work of Wendell Berry throughout this. Bill McKibben has called Wendell Berry a prophet of responsibility. And I find so much intersection between what Berry's trying to do and what he's been trying to do for probably 50 years in his work, and the ideas that are laid out in this book. Berry writes basically that the kingdom of God is life itself. I also find a lot of intersection with Tibetan Buddhism, in particular, the idea of the four immeasurables as practices that could bring us toward the kind of loving, kind, compassionate relationships that need to be emphasized if we're going to get out of this mess that we're in. What I'm less enthusiastic about, this is difficult because I know Philip is listening, is I guess what I missed in this book is a strong attention to creatureliness as something that we need to understand as forms of intelligence, diverse forms of intelligence that exist on the planet, and that the dynamism that we need to recognize is generated there in the kind of creatureliness that we're immersed in, not separate from. So there's a sense that I get in some places in this book of a kind of illusion of disembeddedness, and that it will be humans that come in and sort of insert the dynamism that's needed. But actually, I think that the dynamism, as scholars like Gregory Bateson and again Barry teach us, is there, that we're embedded in it, that we need to recognize it, we need to cherish it, we need to see that as where the sacred lies. So for me, resacralization really means coming to recognize what is sacred in the systems of life that we are immersed in and that we need to protect. So Wendell Berry's work around that and his push for responsibility around those ideas are what most recently have been pushing me and influencing my work with teachers. I think that educators are the key to wanting something different, as Bill said, and to moving in a direction of social transformation that the book Social Vision is asking us to reconsider. So again, I guess my 10 minutes is pretty close to being up. I really appreciate being here. I especially appreciate being back in touch with Philip and all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Do any of the panelists have any responses they would like to give, any other responses they would like to give to each other before we move to the Q&A questions? Okay, so Ellen Bernstein, who's also a participant in the speaker in the conference, writes, "Thank you, Erik. I hope someone in the session can respond to Michael Schellenberger's work and his change of heart and turn to nuclear over wind and solar."
I'm happy to say a few words if you'd like.
Sure.
Just on the topic of nuclear power in general, I think that the reason people are interested in it is because it's a low carbon source of power. I think that it's probably unlikely to play a huge role going forward for a couple of reasons. One is the stuff that everybody knows about, the kind of dangers associated with it. Though I think it's always worth weighing those. I mean, look, if a nuclear power plant breaks, if something goes wrong, then the consequences are large and dangerous. If you run a natural gas-fired power plant absolutely according to spec, it wrecks the planet. So that's worth bearing in mind. My guess is the reason that we won't see, especially in this country, much of a role for nuclear power going forward is mostly because it's incredibly expensive. You know, as Erik was describing and I was describing, the cost of solar power and wind power has dropped like a rock, dropped 90% in the last decade, but the price of nuclear power just keeps going up and up and up. And one reason for that, bear in mind, is that it's a highly centralized form of power, sort of very much in the tradition of the 19th and 20th centuries, whereas the power systems that we seem to be mostly building at the moment are quite distributed, more on the model of the kind of internet, with lots and lots of nodes and things joining in. I think we'd probably be smart to keep nuclear power plants that are operating at the moment operating to the degree that we can do them safely, because they've already been paid for and they're churning out power, and that's good. But my guess is it's not going to be a huge part of things going forward, though Erik or Rebecca or others may have a different sense on that.
I think you're pretty spot on there, Bill. I would say also, you know, the majority of our nuclear power, you know, infrastructure was built in the late 60s, early 70s, and we're seeing a lot of the decommissioning of these power plants, you know, presently now or in the last 10 years or so. One example is our Plymouth nuclear power plant here in Massachusetts. which was decommissioned. And right now they're going through a whole big challenge of where to put their fuel rods. And, you know, one of the main concerns here locally, and especially somebody who lives on an island, if there was some sort of accident or something that happened, it's, you know, the challenge of mobilizing all the people off the island, even Nantucket and the Cape, you know, to different locations should something happen. I think gave a lot of people here, you know, a lot of relief when that power plant was shut down and decommissioned. And then that goes again to what Bill's saying about cost. You know, as power comes offline, you know, you need to bring in more power to replace that power. And as we transition to electric vehicles, electric bus fleets, electric home heating, you know, air to source heat pumps, electric heat, and, you know, converting all of our electricity to 100% renewable, we're going to actually have to increase the power supply there. So cost plays a really big piece of the puzzle. And as Bill was saying, the price of offshore wind is coming down, has come down, it's continuing to come down with each subsequent project, and with solar as well. Another big piece of the puzzle, and you're going to hear a lot of people talking about this, is battery storage. And that's going to play a really big role in you know, helping the grid. It's basically transitioning our grid from, you know, an old, you know, fossil fuel style grid to a new modern grid where we might have more, you know, battery storage, more microgridding, you know, so the grid is just a bit more nimble and able to bring electricity from where it's being produced or stored to where it's needed.
And one way to understand too, what's, you know, why all this kind of decentralized development is so important is because it can happen quickly. You know, the delays of things like the Vineyard Wind project are all have to do with politics and regulation. But once you get the go-ahead, I mean, they just built what I think at the moment is the largest offshore wind project in the world in the North Sea off the UK. And it was, you know, about 18 months start to finish, the construction. 18 months, you barely get a, you know, beginning on building a nuclear power plant. These things take decades, which we don't have. Now, there are people that I admire and trust, like Jim Hansen, the great climate scientist, who have said that we may be able to have a kind of new generation of small modular reactors that are much safer and much cheaper. And if that happens, then people will look at it and figure out what's, you know, makes sense going forward. But at the moment, you know, in the time ahead of us, clearly what we want to do is maximize the sun, the wind, and the batteries to store it. I mean, let's remember, God gave us a hard-working nuclear reactor 90 million miles away. It produces a lot of sunlight. It produces the variations in temperature that cause the wind to blow. We didn't have to pay for it. So the economics are excellent. Let's take full advantage.
There's a quote from the Torah that it exhorts each person to seek the welfare of the city in which you live, which goes to the point that you're both making, that we need to there's a need for the decentralization of the production of power, and that the welfare of each of our cities, we should be able to power them and to keep everyone safe and healthy on a more local level. There was another question that came in, and it was, you know, going again between Erik and Bill. And she writes, how can someone like Bill's platform be used to amplify and uplift the work of someone like Erik, what Erik is doing? And I see that from the work of Bill's involved in at 350.org is amplifying and extolling private enterprises, such as the one Erik is working on, to make sure that this technology happens quickly. She goes on to write that she finds this as a moment of tragedy and for many hopelessness, and that this climate crisis is just one element of a continued devastation that we're experiencing. And she says that this work that Erik is doing is so inspiring, and she wants to know how we could show support for more of the same. And I would just like to start by addressing one of the things in this question, is that if we look at the world as a place of hopelessness and tragedy and destruction, then unfortunately, if that's our outlook, that's what we're going to see. There's a teaching that says the world is our garden. And if we look at the world as a garden, despite the fact that there's a pandemic and there's tremendous amount of suffering, but if our outlook is looking at the world as a garden, it will be easier to see so many of the beautiful solutions that we have in front of us. And it takes bringing people together and having the right conversations. And the main thing is the action of moving things forward. So with that preparation to the answer, I want to turn it back over to the panelists. And so how do we, to restate the final part of the question, how do we show our support for more of the same? How can people who are listening and viewing at home show their support?
Can I address a little bit about that?
Please.
I really understand that comment. My students come in week after week, and they, especially as they begin to understand their own responsibility in the face of the damages that we're seeing within their own communities, within across the larger planet. And it's depressing, right? They feel like overwhelmed with the grief. But what I say to them is, we need to see what's beautiful in our relationships with each other, what we know already about how to care for each other, and the generative process of getting active together, in their case, to bring questions to their own students that could shift the way they think, and the joy that can happen as a result of that collective work. And I think there's quite a bit in this book about the need for individuals to see that they're not alone, that they're always part of a collective, and to engage the collective, right? So this back and forth, the sort of reciprocal relationship between the individual and the collective is such a key point made in this book. And it's really about how do we generate love, and how do we recognize kindness, compassion, and generate joy in each other's accomplishments as we work toward these things, as we realize that we can no longer turn our backs or be unconscious of what's happening. So what's our responsibility, and how do we come together around that responsibility in sort of loving, joyful work? Which is, it's exactly what I see Bill doing in 350.org, and it's exactly what I hear even in Erik's presentation to us about how wonderful and how joyous it's been to collaborate with these other organizations to create what they're creating. And there's all kinds of ways that we can do that, all kinds of ways, both big and small. So, I mean, we have to feel that.
Thank you. I really appreciate your answer.
Yeah.
Rebecca, really, no, great answer as well. And I'd add just a few things. I think for me, being involved in the conversation, the last 10 years, and in speaking to people in the community about this, it's been interesting to kind of track people's willingness and readiness to have these conversations and want to be involved. I would say in the last 4 years, it's been amplified. So if there is some sort of silver lining to the last 4 years, is that people are, I believe, there's more people now in a position to ask that question and to want to be involved and to mobilize. And to that, Bill has a fantastic organization. You can speak about it, 350.org, but we have a local chapter here on Martha's Vineyard. There's local chapters all over. But there's so many opportunities to get involved. And, you know, it's almost like you want to say, I think maybe one of the first steps or something to think about too is getting involved on a local level in politics, or at a town level, whether maybe it's, you know, here in Massachusetts, we have boards of selectmen, we have all types of, you know, economic boards, development boards, and things like that. So there's loads, and these small New England towns are really looking for youth and new ideas, and for people in you know, bright young people to share their thoughts, and, you know, to become community leaders. You know, we really have, you know, at least, you know, on the Cape and Martha's Vineyard and here in Nantucket, we have a very, very aging population. And I think a lot of people are really, you know, looking for, you know, the next generation of leaders in the community to come up.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't see any others in the chat. I'm just scanning the chat to make sure I didn't miss anything. I don't see any others. I want to make sure I give Jesse time to come on at the end of the session to plug a few of the panels that are happening later today, and a study session that's happening at 5:30 of the sources of Hasidus and ecology that we put together. So Jesse, would you like to?
Thank you so much, Binyamin. Yeah, and thank you so much to our panelists for another great and very inspiring conversation. I just want to come on and briefly just plug the last panel of the day, which is going to be happening in about an hour and a half at 3:30 this afternoon. It'll be on spiritual ecology. So continuing themes we've talked about so far today, and it'll feature talks from Ariel Evan Mays, Ellen Bernstein, Jana Siller, and Adam Berman. So sure to be another very exciting and inspiring conversation then. And then later in the evening at 5:30 p.m. tonight, we're hosting a workshop, like Binyamin mentioned, on Hasidus and ecology. That'll be co-hosted by us, the Institute of Jewish Spirituality and Society, and New Voices magazine. So if you're interested in participating in that workshop, where we'll do kind of a deeper dive into Hasidic sources on ecology, please send an email to, let me see if I have this ready. Yeah, please send an email to director@spiritualityandsociety.org. I just dropped it into the chat. And if you can't make it for whatever reason, please feel free to check out that link where there are sources, Hasidic sources on ecology that you can pursue and peruse at your leisure. So once again, thank you to Binyamin. Thank you so much for all our panelists. And hopefully we'll see you back again at this Zoom link at 3:30 for the final panel of today. Thanks again, everyone.